Bonjour et bienvenue à tous et à toutes. Nous sommes heureux de vous accueillir à la troisième session de la série Boîte et outils en sciences humaines numériques. Je suis Jada Watson, coordinatrice des sciences humaines numériques à l'Université d'Ottawa. Good morning and welcome to the third session of the DH Toolbox series. I'm Jada Watson, coordinator of digital humanities at the University of Ottawa, and I'm delighted to be bringing the fifth season of DH Toolbox workshops to you. In today's workshop session, Robert VanderBerg will walk us through his work to digitize NAC's collections. But before we begin, I would like to start our session with an Indigenous land affirmation. Nous rendons hommage au peuple algonquin gardien traditionnel de cette terre. Nous reconnaissons le lien sacré de longue date, l'unissant à ce territoire qui demeure non cédé. Nous rendons également hommage à tous les peuples autochtones qui habitent Ottawa, qu'ils soient de la région ou d'ailleurs au Canada. Nous reconnaissons les gardiens des savoirs traditionnels, jeunes et âgés. Nous honorons aussi leurs courageux dirigeants d'hier, d'aujourd'hui et de demain. We pay respect to the Algonquin people who are the traditional guardians of this land. We acknowledge their long-standing relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. We pay respect to all Indigenous people in this region from all nations across Canada who call Ottawa home. We acknowledge the traditional knowledge keepers, both young and old, and we honor their courageous leaders, past, present, and future. The archives at the National Arts Centre are something of a goldmine, and having had the opportunity to work in the archives with several of my courses, I can attest to the incredible artifacts that are waiting there to be explored. The collection is full of rare objects, including costumes worn by the country's most important actors, stage design maquettes by top designers, and photos of world-renowned artists. Up to a few years ago, the collection was entirely analog, and access to it was on-site only. In this Toolbox session, Robert VanderBerg will discuss how recent digital collaborations with the University of Ottawa and Carleton University have enabled the NAC to expand beyond its walls by pushing the boundaries of the classroom engagement and new technologies. Robert VanderBerg is the archivist curator at the National Arts Centre in Ottawa, where he manages the centre's archives and collection of over 30 visual artworks. He has curated and produced over 40 exhibitions through previous positions with PVW Consultants and Luminato in Toronto. Robert holds a Master of Information from the University of Toronto and an MA in Art History from York University. It is an absolute delight for us to have this sneak peek behind the curtains of the NAC. And with that, I will turn our screen over to Robert.
Excellent. Thank you for having me here. I'm happy to present this topic. I'm also very happy to be part of this workshop series. I hope that everyone gains something from this, and thank you for that very kind introduction. So I will actually skip over my content for this slide because the introduction part is finished and jump right into the history of the National Arts Centre. So the National Arts Centre, we'll give a quick overview here of the centre. I'm going to condense 50 years of history into a very short couple minutes. The centre was a centennial project approved by Prime Minister Lester B. Pearson and driven forward by Hamilton Southern. The goal was to create an international quality facility in the capital for the performing arts, something that was incredibly lacking in mid-century Ottawa, and present the best of the arts of Canada to the world, simultaneously presenting the best of the arts in the world to Canadians. This was an incredibly large project at the time. It involved massive amounts of concrete, as we can see in this photo here. It was also significantly over budget and delivered 2 years late. I noted that it was a centennial project, and you see on the screen there that it was delivered in 1969, so about 2 years late. It remains to this day one of the largest bilingual and multidisciplinary performing arts centers in the world. So the center originated with 5 programming streams: the orchestra, dance, English theater, French theater, and popular music and variety programming. Then in 2017, a 6th stream was added, Indigenous theater. The renovated building opened for Canada 150 in 2017, and it reoriented this building to the city. So in this photo here, we actually see a vantage of the center's building taken from the bridge on top of the canal, which is where its original main entrance was. This was based on a city plan that never really materialized. And so by 2017, there was a desperate need to put a front door on Elgin Street as well. And that was the project that was undertaken by Diamond Schmidt. And that is the new main entrance to the building that we're familiar with today. Now, for a quick summary of the history of the archives. Excuse me. So the idea of the archives as a part of the NAC was present from the very inception of the organization. However, it did take a few years to get things up and running. So here you see Tony Ibbotson was the first archivist of the center. He started in 1979. Tony's role really was just archives, and he had the fortunate position to have 3 staff working with him on the archives of the center. And he was in that role from 1979 to 1984, and really started the collection, identified the core areas of collecting, and really covered the programming streams and the creative documents that the center produced extremely well in those early years. Then there was a short gap, and then Jerry Grace, the second archivist, took over in 1989 and worked at the center to 2008. Now, Jerry's role expanded significantly compared to Tony's. Jerry not only took care of the archives, but Jerry also took on exhibitions and the visual art collection, and his department was 1.5 people, including himself. Then again, another small gap, and in 2015, I began, and I took on both the archives, exhibitions, visual arts, and increasingly information management at the center. And that staff grew from 1.5, and we're in the process of growing to more staff to cover off some of these added responsibilities. Now, the collection itself, as noted in the introduction, really is like a gold mine. It is a gem, and it contains many rare items, and it represents some of the best designers in Canadian theatre. And what I find really fascinating about the collection is that it evidences a very broad story of the performing arts in Canada, both in French and English. There are other performing arts archives in the country. Stratford obviously comes to mind, and they have an excellent collection, well organized, amazing pieces in it. But because of the nature of the organization, it is quite focused on Shakespeare, and particularly English Shakespeare. The NAC's archives is unique in that it covers both French and English, and covers a much broader spectrum of the arts in Canada. Just take a quick sip of water. Now, there's always a but. There are a few challenges associated with the NAC archives. As noted with the 3 archivists, there are large periods of time between them where there was no guidance of an archivist overseeing the collection. So there are particular strengths in years in collecting, and then there are obvious gaps in items from within the collection. The first 2 archivists were also very passionate about the arts, but they weren't trained archivists. Then the other challenges come with resourcing specific issues. So the NAC, first and foremost, is a performing arts center. The dollars will always go to the stage first. As such, the archives not always top a priority list when it comes to funding, but that also extends to a connected issue of a lack of prioritization within the organization. Again, because of the core mandate of the NAC, archives over the years was not always seen as an essential function of the business. Now, I'm going to put some qualifiers here because the next slide is going to paint a potentially negative view of the archives. These challenges faced by the archives at the NAC are not unique to the organization. Many small archives face similar challenges. And second qualifier, I cannot place fault with any of the previous archivists. Both created and maintained an amazing collection with very limited resources. Both were intensely dedicated to the performing arts, and you can see the passion in the collection. And the collection really does exist due to their huge efforts over the years. Now, That said, when I began in 2015, there was a reality to the situation when I arrived. The facilities themselves were in poor condition, with mold evident in some of the storage spaces. Fine art objects were not appropriately handled and stored. And here I will point to the image on the bottom left, where there's a tapestry, which is actually a tapestry by La Liberté, temporarily stored, I will note temporarily stored on a couch in an office space. Many items were stored in at-risk conditions. There's some obvious examples here. So we see many frames stored directly on the ground, boxes stored directly on the ground, and other items stored in rooms that were not appropriate for the type of item, and a general disarray to many parts of the collection. Now, these physical arrangement issues are scary and can be harsh to look at, but that was not, as an archivist, the most worrisome issue coming into the archives. The most significant challenge that I had was that the collection had no finding aids, catalogs, or indexes. The storage and handling issues that you see in these images and the physical arrangement conditions could relatively easily be fixed. The fact that there was no intellectual control of the collection was a much larger challenge. Access to the collection was then in person only and had to be mediated by the archivist or the assistant. And because there were no finding aids, often learning on my part as the archivist was done alongside the researcher. We would go into the collection, we would pull out a box, and I would be learning what was in the box at the same time as the researcher was finding out what was in that box. So, significant challenges when I came on board in 2015. It was clear that things needed to be turned around. Simple plan, accept it. It was very obvious the collection, as I noted before, is a gold mine. There are amazing pieces in that collection. See it for what it is, not for what it isn't. Then the second part, share it. Collections are meant to be shared, and providing access to the collection is a core function of archival work. I simply decided to apologize for the mess and open the doors to the collection and see what comes. And I will note amazing things came from that decision. So, deciding to collaborate produced opportunities very quickly. Shortly after starting at the NAC, Professor Mac Rick from the English department at the University of Ottawa reached out. She knew the archives well, and she knew the NAC based on her past experience with the organization as a theater expert. And she reached out to see if she could work with me to host her students in the archives, where they completed primary research on a broad range of topics related to Shakespeare. From that research, they then worked closely with the library, and I'll shout out to Roxanne Lafleur, as she was hands-on with a lot of the students over these courses to teach tech skills, specifically around cataloging and building online exhibitions. And I'll just pause here to take a look at one example that I find particularly engaging. And I'll note I have a separate screen here, so if I'm looking away, I'm just managing the screen on this side. So highlight here this project, which looked at an Indigenous adaptation of Shakespeare's King Lear. And this exhibition is hosted on the library website. It is based online using a story map tool. And what it did was take items from the collection itself and use that to expand knowledge for people visiting the site about this particular Shakespeare production. So on the left here, we see costume designs. These were found inside the production box that the students consulted. And these were drawings that the costume designer had prepared as a research for the show. And connected to those are all these pins where you can find out more information about the show. So you can dig into the cast, who was involved in the cast, had a pretty impressive cast, actually. Lauren Cardinal, Kevin Loring, Monique Mojica. Then linked videos about the producing the show itself and how various Indigenous communities came together to help create the show. And then more photos from the archives. So here you see very rare images that would only be found in the collection of costume fittings of the actors themselves. And of course, these are all linked with text about the project and about the production, which really expanded knowledge of both the show itself, but using these primary resources from the NAC's collection. Just close that. So that collaboration began in 2016 and continued through 2019. It featured both fourth year and graduate courses. It took a pause because of pandemic in this case and Professor Mackrick's teaching schedule, but it is something that we hope to renew again in the future. Then beginning in 2019, which seems too short ago, I almost had to double check that year, but a collaboration with Professor Watson began. Of course, we know Professor Watson, which worked with fourth year students, and we covered 3 courses well into the pandemic as well. Roxanne actually connected us from the library, noting that Professor Watson had similar interests, and I, of course, agreed to host these students in the archives. Again, the situation was similar. The students came to the archives to explore content specific to the National Arts Centre, but because of the research angle, the topics were much larger than just Shakespeare related. So we covered everything from how to market opera, how to exhibit 2 busts that are in our collection of composers, to a data analysis of early programming history. So very broad research questions that were being explored in the archives. And here I'll highlight one project, and we'll come back into these as well following this presentation. Old But Gold, which features one of my favorite objects in the collection of the NAC, Glenn Gould's famous CD 318, his much preferred Steinway piano. Now, this project, again, hosted on the library website, this one using a maquette to build the online exhibition, had a unique integration of the image of the piano. So here you see the keyboard of CD 318, and these highlighted keys bring up more information about Glenn Gould and his career. Now, some of these are very closely related to the archives. So this first key brings up Glenn Gould's chair, also an item that's in our collection. And for very keen Glenn Gould fans, they might argue that the chair is actually more important than the piano itself, because the chair followed Gould throughout his entire career, whereas CD 318, the piano, was only around for a portion of his career. But it also then links items outside the collection. So here we see videos of Glenn Gould playing that are sourced from the National Film Board. And you see other press clippings and announcements that were sourced outside the NAC's archives. So it really is a collection of a larger research topic, but focused around one of the items in our collection, and something that people across Canada really don't have great access to because we have not been able to make it accessible virtually up until this project here. So I think I'll leave those projects at that. Again, there'll be time for questions if people want to explore what those projects were, how the archives participated in it. We'll have a quick discussion, Professor Watson and myself, after the presentation about what that collaboration was like. But that's just a flavor of the type of projects that we undertook together. Now, another major collaboration is one with Carleton Immersive Media Studio, or the Sims Lab, and it's titled NAC at 50+. This project goes back to 2012 with a number of SSHRC applications. This audience, I'm sure, will be aware of what SSHRC is, Social Sciences Humanities Research Council of Canada, a funding body that provides funding to research projects based in the humanities. As a former grad student, I have submitted many of these requests, and I'm very pleased that this one is finally one I can associate my name with as an approved funding request. The funding finally was approved in March 2020, again, after a number of applications and a number of revisions to the project itself in two forms. So we actually got one grant for linking the project partners and another grant for funding the project in general. And the goal of this project, after a few revisions, was to create a virtual NAC that explores the center's history, its building, and examines what it is to be a National Historic Site in the 21st century. The initiative uses cutting-edge technology to provide virtual access to the building and to the collection. So there's video game technology that underlines a virtual experience of the building. And then 3D scanning and photogrammetry was used to provide detailed models of spaces and objects from within the archives collection. Now, this comes in two components. The first is an interactive storytelling component. So this is a virtual 3D application that is available online and tells the full history of the NAC in 9 narratives, available in both English and French. So a user comes into this virtual space, the NAC, and they are allowed to select one of 9 narratives. Of course, they could move through to select all 9 if they were to repeat it. And what that narrative does is guide them through a section of the center's history. So it's broken down into 3 pieces, kind of the founding of the center, the decade leading up to the opening in 1969, then the early and middle years, so the first 30 years of the center's history, followed by the last 20 years, 2000 through present, called the rejuvenation of the center. So they select their time period, and then they can select one of 3 narratives within that time period. And they will have kind of a fictional tour guide representing one single perspective. So if they choose the rejuvenation period, they might choose an Indigenous leader actor to guide them through a perspective on those 20 years of history. Or they could select a visual arts artist who is commissioned to create a work for the center to guide them through the first 10 years of planning history of the center. Associated with that is an asset library. So users will be able to move around the virtual NAC and they'll discover assets, much like the costume that we see on the right of the screen here. Those assets are available online. It's a database that supports PDFs, videos, audio, and 3D models, and it integrates with that storytelling experience. So as I noted, as you move through the building, learning about the history of the center through these narratives, users will uncover assets which really highlight and illustrate the points made in the narrative. And that includes costumes, posters, photographs, maquettes, artworks, furnitures. Those assets really could be almost anything within the collection itself and within the building. The assets also exist in a database separate from the virtual experience. So you can move into the virtual experience and have it be part of the narrative, or you can access that database separately and simply view all the assets that they have highlighted in the collection. Now I'll show a couple images here of what that virtual model looks like. So here we have 2 spaces being shown. On kind of the top left, we have Salem Hall, and on the bottom right, we have the Israeli studio. So these are 3D renders. As I noted, they're driven by video game technology. So not virtual reality, but 3D spaces that a user can navigate using a computer or technology interface. What happens is a user first enters these spaces. They are given a kind of cinematic tour of the space with this narrative overlay, and then they are offered the opportunity to free roam them. So not only does it explore the history of the center through those narratives, but it also provides virtual access to the building. And it's really an unparalleled access regardless of one's physical location, because it's all moderated via these 3D models. I'll note while I'm here, it's a fascinating process of building these. The Sims Lab starts with a building information model, which was acquired from the architects. And then they came in and did a 3D laser scan of the space, which allowed them to build the 3D virtual model. And then they came in and took photographs of all the surfaces. So the backs of the chairs, the carpets, the walls, the ceilings, the stage floor. And they built skins on top of that 3D model to create an incredibly accurate and detailed render of that space. So I talked a lot about external collaborations and how they've allowed us to kind of explore the collection and make it accessible. But one thing that has stemmed from them that has proved incredibly valuable is internal projects. So through the generosity of the university, specifically the library, we were provided a presence on JSTOR Forum, something that the NAC did not have up until 2017, I believe we started this. And it really was made possible through the generosity and also huge efforts of Roxanne, who developed a custom metadata schema with us and provided that space to us. And what this did was create a much needed digital catalog for the collection. So JSTOR Forum, and I'll kind of dive into that a little bit, provides a better understanding of our collection. It provides us real-time research results, and it allows for future publishing online. So again, I'll dive in or talk about all those a little bit further, but just as kind of a big picture overview, JSTOR Forum allows us to upload digital files representing an item in our collection and simply attach metadata to it. So we can sort items from our collection, we can add notes about condition, we can add information about authors or creators or producers, all of which then allows us to search those items and provide results for us internally in the archives, but also to researchers. Now, this was a significant opportunity and one which sat on the back burner until COVID hit. So it's one of those projects where we kind of played with it, slowly built it up over time. We had a couple volunteers working on it for the first year. When COVID hit, we needed suddenly, of course, a project to work from home on. And this became the primary project for the archives for the first year of COVID. As it stands now, there are over 2,500 items in that collection, a lot of house programs, which is where we have really focused our efforts for strategic purposes. But it does include costumes and posters and photographs and reports. And we've dedicated a fair amount of staff time to this. We've had 2 co-op students working on this. We had 1 student come in over the summer under the Canada Summer Jobs Grant to work on this. And we've increased the hours that the archives assistant, and shout out to Sarah here, Sarah Martini, who's been working on this project over the years with extreme dedication. And so that's allowed us to really build this up fairly quickly. Now I'll just show you what our catalog is looking like at the moment. I apologize, I'm just going to log in with a different browser. So of course, this is a cloud-based application. Standard login screen. Which takes us to our project page. And this is where we are building really the collection. And what you see when we land here is we have thumbnails on the left of the items that have uploaded, and then really just presented in this view a collection of the metadata associated with them. So right now we're seeing some blank ones because those are recently uploaded to the system, but metadata has not been entered. So we'll skip to a different page, and here you see some entries where metadata has been entered, a significant amount per item. So as a real-time example of how this has benefited us recently, when Martha Henry, a well-known actor, passed away, I believe just last week, the NAC needed to quickly respond with a statement. And one of the questions for those writing the statements was, when was Martha Henry at the National Arts Center? A simple search. Sorry, enter it one too many times. Quickly yields 5 results where Martha Henry's name appears with that item. So we see here a house program for A Midsummer Night's Dream, interestingly produced in 1968. So Martha Henry is associated with Stratford Theatre, and she came up here before the center opened and presented a work kind of under the National Arts Center's name before the building actually opened. And here a poster from 1983, and I'll just click on that so you see what an entry looks like. So here we have a high-res upload of the poster, which can be downloaded and used in the future. And we have all the metadata associated with that. So we see everything from the dates of the production. We see the creators, we see the production title itself. We see information such as the playwright, artistic director, all of which then allows us to sort and search for that information. And I'll just click on this house program because it also hosts PDFs, which is how we store all the house programs, and it stores them in page views. So this is a relatively short program in that it only has 3 pages, but most of our programs are about 30 to 40 pages. And what JSTOR Forum allows us to do is actually host the entire program on the website, which for future purposes may be beneficial for us as we look towards publishing these to the NAC's website itself. Let me just go back to my presentation. Now, as I noted, up until this project started, access to the collection was in person only. As I mentioned at the start of this presentation, if you had a question for the archives, you were invited to come to the archives and we will search the collection together. For the first time now, through these collaborations, we have the opportunity to move access from in-person to a digital access, which has been hugely beneficial to us, especially as you can imagine now that we can't host people on site at the NAC. So just to wrap up before opening some discussion, what is the future of the archives? I painted a somewhat bleak picture of my arrival, but I can very confidently say now that the future of the archives is very bright. Increasingly, efforts and resources at the NAC are being put into digital. So that includes a focus on information management, and archives is at the table with that discussion, which allows us to plan for the end of a record's life cycle from the very beginning, which, if we look back to the history of the center, where we have issues in the collection based on when an archivist was present and when they weren't, should alleviate those issues, because what is archival will be designated when the record is actually created and filed within the classification system, something that we have not been able to do to date. We will also keep saying yes to collaboration. As I noted, collaboration creates opportunity. The projects that we have had the fortune to work on, the SIMS project, JSTOR, the student research projects, and making that information available to people via the library's website only happened through collaboration. So we'll continue saying yes to all those collaboration opportunities. And now, just to close and to kind of make myself feel a little better, you'll note that this photo here on the right is from the exact same vantage point as this photo here on the bottom right. So significant changes have happened at the NAC. As I noted, the physical changes were relatively easy to take care of, but the digital changes have taken a few years longer, but they are well underway, mostly through the hard work of our partners. And I think I'll open it up there to discussion with Professor Watson.
Thank you so much. I always love hearing you talk about your time with the NAC archives and what you were faced with, and my gosh, what you've done in, I was just counting, 6 years, 7 years now at the
Six.
NAC.
Yeah.
It's really remarkable how much, and you've had to do like almost 2 of those years during lockdown. So that presented challenges too. And so we do have a question from Christy, and maybe we'll start there actually before we jump back to projects, because I think we're going to focus mostly on those projects. So Christy Von Moos works at Ingenium, and she asks, how many items do you have in the collection? Do you have permanent access to JSTOR, and can you download the data to migrate it to systems if you need to?
Those are all good questions. So I will just go back a few slides and talk about the collection itself a little bit. As I noted, without intellectual control of the collection, it is difficult to put exact numbers on what is in the collection in terms of quantities. The main collecting areas are around kind of stage maquettes, of which we have 175. I'll note these are rare. I had the archivist from Stratford Archives over when she was up in Ottawa a number of years ago, and she saw the collection that we have, and she was astounded because they are very difficult for the archives to get a hold of. Typically, they remain the property of the designer, not the presenting organization. So when I note that the previous archivists were passionate, they were, because Jerry personally formed relationships with the designers to make sure that these items got into the collection, which now is an unbelievable opportunity for us. We have about 8,000 posters, 200 plus costumes. Again, those ones are rare because we actually have to take them out of circulation from the production department. Hard to do because it costs the organization money to do that. And about 16,000 plus house programs, and that one grows by the day. It's the photographs, press clippings, and corporate records where we have many, 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 many items, and it's hard to put a linear, like a number on linear storage amounts of those records. So I will just suffice to say we have many, and some of them also exist at Library Archives Canada because we are subject to LAC Act. Many of our records actually transfer to LAC too. Now, there was a second part of that question. JSTOR forum, we have ongoing access through the generosity of the library and University of Ottawa, for which I'm very grateful. I do realize we are there on generosity. So there might be a point where we look at other systems, and yes, we can extract that. Basically, we can go in and extract a CSV file, and then we could remap it to any other database in the future. Assuming we could upload the CSV file, but that's really the only restriction.
Perfect. Thank you. That was a great place to start, I think. So I wonder if you'd go to the slide with the student projects. I feel so grateful because my class used to work with Library and Archives Canada, and so I wanted to do something where the students would actually be able to go into and handle materials a little bit more than you can with LAC, because you really need to know what you want to look at. And so when Roxanne Lafleur suggested the NAC, it just felt like a match made in heaven, because students got to see an archive in a way they really never were able to before. So I wonder, actually, because I got fixated on this object, I wonder if you might walk us through the controversial busts. It's a project that really, I think you and I have both been trying to get someone to do since this partnership started. And thankfully, we got someone to do it this year. And I think it turned out really, really nicely. So, and there are sort of, there are different artwork to have in your archive. It's not really, as a performing arts archive, you don't typically expect to see busts of composers. So I might wonder if you might talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, one thing to understand about the archives is there's a bit of a blur within the NAC between the archives and the visual art collection. the NEC, this is a whole different presentation, which I'd be happy to give at some point, but the NEC commissioned about 30 some artworks when it opened the building and has acquired a handful of artworks since then. Without guidance, because we're not a collecting institution, some of those pieces kind of sit between archives and artwork. And in the archives itself, we have some pieces that have been donated over the years that really don't fit into our proper visual arts collection that we say they're kind of being acquired through the archives itself. There's some nuance there, which I could go into, but we don't need to for this presentation. Long story short, 2 busts landed in our collection of Hungarian composers, which created some questions given the history of the government in Hungary and its promotion of particular composers for propaganda purposes, which caused some questions about their presentation in Canada. So when I first started the NEC, we had these 2 busts presented in Seldom Foyer, and I was kind of provided a bit of history where some of our patrons had questions why we have these particular busts. There's not always positive memories associated with their cultural past and these particular composers for a variety of reasons. And so during the renovations to the building, we had to take out the entire art collection. These 2 busts made their way into storage, and they don't really have a curatorial purpose to be outside on permanent display. So they've been in our storage room for probably 3, coming on 4 years now, but it's always been a nagging question in my mind of, do we display these busts or do we not display these busts? Because sometimes people ask questions about where were they? They were in the center for 20 years, maybe 25. So people do wonder what happened to those busts. And so it's a question I've never really had time to answer, and we've put it out consistently over the years as a question. Maybe a student wants to pick this one up. And finally, a student, Emma Brown, did. And maybe you can kind of describe her process with that.
Sure. I really don't know what it was that struck her, but I'm grateful for it because we have been pitching it though every year. But this was actually done this last winter during pandemic. So it was actually a really interesting opportunity because the students, you know, the whole premise was let's bring them into the archive, and they couldn't actually go. So thanks to Robert, who would basically be the students' eyes and ears and go in and take photos or digitize things or provides like zip files of materials that were already scanned. And so I believe you had to take photos of the busts, a few, because there were some of the busts in their original sort of station outside the foyer, but in the archive, like to get some really nice shots of the busts in the archives, you needed to go in and do that for us.
Yeah, so the early collaboration, part of the learning process for students was how to take images and collect kind of the digital artifacts of these items themselves. With pandemic, we had to mediate that because we couldn't take anyone in. So we actually, I think Sarah might have actually taken the photos of the bus, or at least some of them. So all that content was provided to the students as kind of in zip files of, this is what we have. Now let's see what you can do with it.
Yeah. And so her research really revolved around the history of communism in Hungary, the socialist doctrines that governed culture and heritage in the time that the composers were alive, and really focusing as much as she could on the life and career of the composer who had ties to the Communist Party. And so I don't know if you want to scroll through a little bit, but I think it's mostly photos. I'll just have a look through on my side too.
It ranges from kind of an overview of the Hungarian Communist Party. This was a big project. It was kind of shocking just how big this project became. So to understand the donation and to understand the context of displaying, you had to understand the history of the Communist Party. That's significant topic in its own right. So that is the kind of introductory part of the exhibition. Then it looks at art in communist Hungary, so what the role of art is within that regime. And then it dives into the history of the artists themselves. And in depth, I mean, this was very detailed. We started with a couple images of us, a handful of items from the archives collection. I think in that package, there was an invite to the reception, maybe some production notes about the reception itself, and a few kind of notes to file that former archivist has made about kind of the very minor controversy and questions being asked about why the busts were there. That was the starting point for all the research that followed and contextualized those issues.
And I guess I should add that most students in this class, and I believe in Dr. Mackrick's two working groups, because this is a lot of work, both to learn how to digitize and also then catalog, but also to do this kind of research on projects that are a fairly large scale for an undergraduate class. And she wanted to work alone. So that sort of, she took on a very large project. I think probably not realizing it at first. And then when she presented it to us at the end, we were very surprised at how large in scope she went. And she really drove down each nook and cranny of these issues to really explore what was going on. And of course, you know, it's really like an ethical or moral question. There's no real answer, but I think she offers some interesting insights for consideration about, you know, the fact that these artworks have they have important cultural value. They allow us to have some really important conversations about cultural diplomacy, but at the same time, they might be traumatic for Hungarians who are now in Canada who lived under this regime and who might have suffered due to it. So she really digs into a lot of really interesting issues through this project.
I think it's, speaking of diplomacy, I think another project that's interesting to share is the
Reagan's visit.
Yeah, I've left my presentation by mistake there. Let's look at quickly Reagan's visit to Canada. The NAC, of course, plays a role in the arts in Canada, but we are a crown corporation and we have a role to play in politics and diplomacy in Canada. Some prime ministers like to visit the NAC more, but many over the 50+ years history have had some well-known and significant state visits to the center. Ronald Reagan was one of them. 27 hours spent in Canada. A fair number of those hours spent at the NAC at a reception. And here we had two students look at that visit. And again, fairly limited content from the archives as to what we had, but to then expand a bigger project from there. So here you see a map kind of showing the geographical location of how that visit took place, some context for the visit itself. And then once you dive into it, some background with some associated images. I'll note you see Prime Minister Trudeau here. He was one particularly who used the NAC a lot for political and diplomatic purposes. So we have many photos of him in the collection. So they arrive in Ottawa. It gives lots of talk about kind of what happened exactly when they arrived here in the city. And then it looks at more talks that happened at Parliament, again, integrating some of the archival images here. We have a lot of photographs from the event. So here's reception at the NAC itself. Looking really in detail, almost every movement in those 27 hours. The afternoon. And then it looks at the NAC program itself. So here you see them kind of greeting audience and greeting the public in the foyer before going to a gala dinner and a concert featuring Canadian talent at the time. So again, this student project started with something fairly small. They were interested in politics and how that relates to the NAC. There were a number of things that we could look into. They found some content on this Reagan visit, mostly photographs of the visit. The house program was also in there. I think I had a menu from the restaurant in there as well. But then their project quickly expanded into something much larger that allowed them to explore the whole context of that visit, both culturally, but also beyond just the walls of the NAC. And then also use these tools to present that in a visual way. So in this case, use story map and able to locate it kind of geographically as the framework for that content and that information.
Yeah, and I'm sure you've all noticed by now that they used President Reagan's head as the pin. So you actually get to see him traveling from the United States and around the city, which was an interesting touch, which personalized it a little bit. So if you have questions, please don't hesitate to throw them into the Q&A or into the chat, but we'll just sort of keep diving into some of these collaborative projects. I wonder, Robert, if you might sort of speak to, you've already talked about the sort of benefits of these collaborations for the stuff that you're working on or the things that you want to do for the NAC, but you know, it's also important to talk, I think, about some of the challenges. So I wonder if there are any challenges that with working with outside projects that have popped up, or if it's been all fairly seamless.
I can't say it's been seamless. That would be overly optimistic. I think the number one challenge is probably time. And the challenge appears in two ways. When we were operating normally and that we could provide access on site, that was incredibly rewarding, but also time consuming. So once students are able to see the materials and touch the materials, they usually want to keep coming back and working with the materials. So especially with students, because we're working with fourth year and graduate students at the University of Ottawa, they're invested. And we would have some students come back 5-6 times to the archives to do more work or look at more things, which really, when you have a staff of 1.5 at the time, we're up to kind of 2 equivalent full-time staff now. That's a significant amount of time, especially if you're trying to juggle 2 classes at once, which we did for 1 year. So for those 4 months or 3 months of the semester, it can be rather intense. So I would say that's probably the biggest challenge pre-pandemic. Post-pandemic, the challenge is actually the same, except it's different because instead of time with students on site, it is time on site to provide information for students. The downside when it came to the pandemic is there's an immediate reward to working with students in the archives and seeing them react to the physical objects. That reward is lost when you're just having a PDF of a house program or PDF of a concert program or a menu rather. And it makes it more difficult, I would say, to invest the time because the reward in that case isn't as immediate. Now, it's definitely still in the end when you see the projects come together, the reward is still there, but that immediate sense of it is diminished when you can't have the access on site. So I say that's our biggest challenge. That said, as I noted in the presentation, providing access to the collection is a core archival function. There is, in my mind as an archivist, not a lot of points to having the collection if people are not going to access it. With these digital projects, more and more people can access that, and I don't have to mediate it because they're available online or through digital means. The reality of the NAC archives is we have to mediate that access. So we have to invest the time if we want these things to happen, and it's something we're happy to do, but that's not to say it's not challenging. And then I'll kind of add the footnote, copyright. Copyright is always the challenge in the performing arts.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, but it's, you know, they're really complicated discussions to have, but they're so important to have. Obviously very important to have. But to sort of have the discussion just because it might live on Google doesn't mean that you have the right to use it is the same as just because it exists in an archive doesn't mean you have the right to use it. Thank you. So we have two great questions here. First, it's a multi-part question. Do you ever take volunteers at the NAC archives? Do you accept practicum students? Have you ever participated in a MyTax fellowship, or would you consider it with a history MA student? I guess basically, is it possible to participate in the future somehow with your collection?
So as I had committed to, obviously, I have to say yes, yes, and yes. We do have volunteers in a few different fashions. Before pandemic, we had volunteers regularly coming to the collection and doing both photography of objects and metadata entry into JSTOR forum. Very committed volunteers, in fact. Post-pandemic, we continue with volunteers. It is more challenging because the volunteer ask is harder when you're asking someone to do something entirely virtual. Part of as with the students, part of the reward for volunteers is handling the items. That's, as an archivist, you're attracted to the archives because the items and the physical nature of them is important. So we do have volunteers. As we move on site more and more, we will be having volunteers reintegrated into that process, and they're a great way to get the collection built. Yes, we have had students in a few different fashions and at a few different levels. We've had high school co-op placements, very successful over the summer. We've had master's level practicum placements where we did similar entry and cataloging, but more in depth. So with a high school student, it was simply metadata. We uploaded the house program. The student came in, did the metadata all in JSTOR form. With the master's level student, that one was through Carleton, and this student was interested particularly in fashion and design. And so she worked hands-on with the costume collection, and she not only cataloged them, she also pulled out all the costumes, repacked them, and did a very quick condition report on all the costumes. Again, all that information for us is available in JSTOR forum. So we're really making that one tool do a lot of things. And again, shout out to Roxanne, is because that custom metadata schema is really unique to what we do. So we need to make JSTOR forum, which is not kind of a collections management tool, do collections management things. And through that schema, we're able to do some of that. And yes, we're open to future collaborations and happy to discuss those further.
We should make sure to leave your email address at the end. or I suppose you could always email me at dhnarts@uottawa.ca and I can put you in touch. We have another question about the pedagogical value. So the pedagogical value for participating students is clear, but how do we ensure that the outputs from such projects are useful and do get used, i.e. are vetted for quality and then circulated widely? So we could probably both speak to this. I mean, first of all, I work very closely with Robert and with Roxanne when I do these courses. And so there are multiple opportunities along the way for vetting. So the cataloging is one assignment where I work closely with both to make sure that artifacts are cataloged accurately. And so students do have to revise those throughout the semester. They do have to present sort of like an exhibit plan. They do it in PowerPoint so that they can get that visual feel of what the exhibit could look like, because a lot of these exhibits have that sort of PowerPointy feel. And both Robert and Roxanne come, and the three of us provide feedback, and we all do it in different ways, right? So Robert will provide feedback on the artifacts and any historical thing that they might need to dig into a little bit more, or might correct a misinterpretation of the details. Roxanne usually comes in with some aesthetic commentary because she works on these exhibits quite a lot, and I'll help them with a research issue. So if they're really unsure of, where to go to find some kind of information, I usually fill in that gap too. And between the three of us, we do that preliminary vetting. And then the final exhibits, they don't get published immediately. So anything that's been published is because students have done revisions. Because I do think it's important to make sure, while I would never police a student's writing, because I think that's a very personal thing, um, you know, basic grammar and inconsistencies or errors are caught, and they have to be revised before we make them public. They also have to have copyright, like permission to reproduce these materials, as well. And so there are often projects that have a bit of a lag with making them public, because there are some revisions to do, or permissions to be had. The circulation part is really tricky. I use Twitter a lot to make sure that when they're done, we can kind of celebrate them virtually. They are publicly accessible via the library website. And I'm always looking for opportunities to have student exhibit showcases where they can share their work with the public. Of course, we had a great one in 2019 and then couldn't have one again for the last 2 years. But once we are permitted to go back in person, I hope that we can have sort of a retrospective exhibit, or maybe even two, because a lot of work has happened digitally over the last 2 years that we can highlight. Pandemic was hard, but it wasn't, all of our work wasn't lost. And so I think that there's great opportunity to still shine a light on the projects that were done during those 2 years. Robert, what do you have to add about sort of the vetting process?
I would say in University of Ottawa collaborations with both you and Professor Mackrick, it's been fourth year and graduate students. And I've, on average, been impressed to thrilled about the work submitted. There's a dedication to students at that point, and they want to see quality projects submitted, and they do the work to get there. I didn't highlight a collaboration with Carleton where we're working with first and second year students. Unsurprisingly, it is a different level of quality. And in that case, some projects just don't get published. So I've had a handful coming from those students. These are bigger courses. These are courses where, you have 60 people enrolled and they're significantly younger. And you can't quality manage hands-on with the students like we do with the smaller classes. And at the end of the term, I get a preview of the projects. Some of them are fantastic and they do get posted publicly on the university website. Other ones just aren't there. So I give feedback, and if the students want to make corrections or make changes, they are given the opportunity to do so. And in that case, they are presented publicly. And if not, they're simply not released. So I've had ones where there's been incorrect information, non-factual tidbits, copyright that wasn't cleared, where they just sit behind a firewall. They're graded on the professor's end in that case, but they never become public. So we do have that process of checking before publishing that happens in all cases. We work really hard, I would say, with those students, especially these smaller courses, to make sure we cover all the details. As I noted, copyright's a big one. We will work with the students to make sure the copyrights are cleared appropriately. Future publishing is where now that when I first started this, I had no idea where it was going to go. No, it was just jump in, see what happens. We've seen some great projects. Projects that are ready to publish, I would say, in a much, much broader form than they currently are. And actually the King Lear one here that I showed is one. These were master's students. It is polished visually. The research was top notch. The quality overall is ready to go. I continually look for opportunities within the NAC to feature these in a broader way, and have started conversations about what that would look like kind of on our website or on our education platforms, a lot of them that we've been relaunching over the past year to really focus on the digital. So those are active conversations. The challenge, of course, is that we're a bilingual institution. So anything we publish on our website needs to be French and English. By the nature of these courses, the students work in either French or English, and then they're done the project. So how do we then get a project translated and posted to our website is kind of the hurdle, and in what form on our website. Those are the two hurdles I kind of need to clear, but they're ones I would love to clear in the next year or two, because when you have these collaborations and those opportunities are opened, as I kind of have in my notes, the gold mine is there for the collection, but we are not the digital experts. Other people bring those to these collaborations. And in this case, it's the students. So we should feature and highlight those works wherever we can. And we're looking for opportunities to do that in a much broader way.
Yeah, and I would add, this actually isn't an archives related thing, but you did play a role, Robert. Last fall, my students in the public musicology class also did exhibits where they interviewed um, musicians and individuals that work in the cultural sphere in Ottawa, and a number of the students focused on the NAC. And so there's even more there, where some students in my class have captured how the NAC pivoted during COVID, which is another opportunity to highlight NAC's rich history. Oh yes, this comment here: translation of projects could be learning opportunities for students in the Department of Translation, which maybe we should look into to get them all translated so that students have the experience of translating, but then you get the output for your website. So we should.
I'm sure our translation department would love the opportunity to have a little less work.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I don't know if there's no other. Oh, we have another question. Do you need to ensure the use of open source software and platforms for funding purposes and also sustainability?
That's a broad question. And the answer is probably a yes or a no. Sorry, a yes and a no. I am not the tech expert. In fact, you're probably more of a tech expert than I am. Through the library, most of that is either open source or freely available. And that is, I would assume, partially for convenience, but also for sustainability. And you can talk to that. But I would say when it comes to our collaboration with Sims, it is not open source. And that is mostly because at that level of technology, the cutting edge nature of it, it's not, the best tool is not available in an open source way in that case. So there are particular challenges presented with how we maintain that project over time that we are sorting out now, because that project is about 2/3 done. We're now starting to look at how to maintain it for the long term. And that is a significant part of digital projects that is often overlooked, that we are certain not to overlook this time.
Yeah, well, I can't speak for the library, but I can speak. The library has a license with Omeka for the sort of Omeka has a platform that is open source and freely available for individuals to create an account and use. But if you want sort of a more robust tool that has more plugins and applications, the institutional or a licensed version, I think, is what's needed. And so the University of Ottawa Library has that. And so we benefit because we don't have to worry about who's going to host it and who's going to sort of maintain it. Like, I maintain the actual student work, but the library sort of maintains, I guess I would say, connection and sustainability of those Omeka spaces. And then the tools that the students use, most of our students tend to be drawn to external plugins. So the Reagan project, I believe the King Lear project, I think those ones listed here all use something called StoryMap.js, which is created by NightLab. So if there's ever a problem with NightLab, I do fear that we would end up losing those projects. So I think part of what we do in this next year should be to think about how we can archive and preserve those so that we don't, if something ever happens with NightLab, that we don't lose them forever. But then Omeka has its own built-in exhibit tools. The old but gold used one called Neatline that is built into Omeka, and the busts use the just simple exhibit tool. So those ones, because Omeka, their Omeka products get maintained by the service. So, you know, like anything digital, I think we do need to be thinking about long-term sustainability of these projects, especially since they, you know, the goal in doing them was not to create these one-off projects, sort of like a term paper, like, but to create something that could have a longer life, and be there for the future. Great. Well, if we don't have any other questions, I'll keep my eye on the Q&A. This was a really great presentation. I think that it was just such an opportunity to see what's behind the curtains at the NAC, but also to see just the potential for student projects here. And I guess I'd like to sort of give another shout out to Roxanne Lafleur, who's really the backbone of a lot of this work. We could not do any of it without her. She really works with, I think, every professor who does an Omeka project in their course works with Roxanne. And, you know, we're also grateful to you, Robert, for basically opening your doors and just letting us all come in and work and explore with, there's no limits to access. And to continuing that through the pandemic when we couldn't physically be there. I think the students were very surprised to know that you would very happily go in and digitize things for them, because that's a significant task. And I know they were very grateful, and so am I. So thank you. And thank you for sharing this with us today.
It's been a pleasure all the way along, and thank you for having me today.
So with that, if you have questions for Robert, you can send me an email at dhnarts@uottawa.ca, and I will forward them along and put you in touch. And in 2 weeks, on November 17th, I believe, at 11:30, we'll have Christy Von Moos and Fiona Smith Hale from Ingenium coming to speak about digital asset management, and it's going to be another great session on archives. So thank you everyone for joining us. Hope to see you again in 2 weeks, and have a great rest of your week.